All right, so first off, my name is Riel Amand. I am an application developer at Smart Data. I got lucky enough to get this opportunity very recently. I started back here just in August. But I was interning with Smart Data since May, and I've been lucky enough to know a lot of the people here for quite a few years. So I've played fantasy with some of these guys before. So let's get into it. So this presentation is titled Fantasy Football, the Draft, the Season, and Winning It All. This is not a technical lunch and learn. This is definitely a different vibe. So just letting you know now. So let's get into it. Come on. All right. So I wanted to make this presentation for everybody. I don't just want to assume you have years of experience playing fantasy football and know exactly what's going on. So if you don't have any experience with fantasy football, the beginning of this presentation is definitely for you. So I'm going to go through kind of all the big fundamental aspects here, and then we'll kind of get into strategy. So what is fantasy football? And I'm talking about season-long leagues. You might have heard of daily fantasy. I'm not going to be talking about that. So fantasy football is a game where users create teams made up of various NFL players. This is done in many other sports. So there's fantasy hockey with the NHL, fantasy basketball with the NBA, fantasy baseball with the MLB. I've never done those. I don't know how they work. So in the NFL, these teams compete. Your teams of players, right? They will compete in weekly matches against other teams in their fantasy league. And you're only playing one team per week. So it's a head-to-head kind of matchup. Players for your team are acquired in a variety of ways. So this includes the draft, free agency, and trades. And we'll be talking about each of those things later. So how is a general fantasy league structured? Well, they all follow the same basic structure. There's a draft to fill out your roster before the NFL regular season starts. There's a regular season in your league where you play a variety of people. Standings at the end of the regular season will determine, of course, placement in the playoffs. And there's a playoff and championship which determines prize money. Now, what's important to note is the regular season and playoffs are all going to occur within the time frame of the NFL regular season. Most leagues will end, in fact, by week 16 of the NFL regular season. And actually, the NFL regular season itself is 17 weeks long. So most fantasy seasons will be 1 week shorter than the NFL regular season. And I'll talk about why that is. So basically, a lot of NFL teams will tend to sit a lot of their starters in week 17 if their playoff spot has already been decided. That often turns into your fantasy players are no longer playing. For example, last year, the Baltimore Ravens sat their entire starting roster in week 17, including NFL MVP Lamar Jackson. That would have hurt quite a few people. So most leagues will not play that week. So I'll talk about Smart Data and CMBS and what we do here. This is kind of a nice example of this general structure. So while there's been some tweaks to point systems and rosters, and these have kind of occurred slowly over the years, the season structure is always the same. So there's a draft in August, although this year, due to pandemic level circumstances, this year we pushed it to September 8th. There is a 13-game regular season, and there is a 3-week playoff. Now, to be fair, if you have only 4 teams making the playoffs, you'll only have a 2-week playoff, but anything more than that, and it's going to be 3. So before I start talking about strategy, to let you know I'm not a crackpot, and I actually do know what I'm doing on some level, I'm going to go through my own history here. So I played fantasy football since 2011, and in that time, I've gotten a record of 113, 71, and 1. Yeah, there's really a tie in there. It's not like 0-0, which is the most common way to get a tie. It was genuinely like 81.42 to 81.42. It was an actual kind of just coincidental tie. This is equivalent to a 61.4% win percentage. So I've been a diamond rank, which is Yahoo's highest available rank player, meaning I'm in the 99th percentile of all Yahoo fantasy players since 2016. I have 2 10-win regular seasons. I'm a 4-time league champion, a 1-time second place finish, and 2-time third place finish. So I'd like to think I do know what I'm doing here. So I'm going to believe that my success comes from a core set of principles that I follow, and that's what I'm going to be talking about in the rest of the presentation. So these principles come from a variety of places: Moneyball, New England Patriots, the Baltimore Ravens, they all kind of have some unique ways of managing their teams and rosters that I think are really smart. So let's talk about what the draft looks like for any given year. So any given fantasy draft will last around 14 to 15 rounds. This means each player is going to make one pick per round. So you have one pick in round 1, one pick in round 2, and so on and so on. While there are many ways to determine the order of a draft, you can do it completely custom if you want. The standard form is snake order. If you don't know what this is, the first pick of the first round would be the last pick of the second round, but the first pick of the third round, but the last pick of the fourth round. So the order is constantly reversing every round. There are no trades in drafts, at least not to my knowledge. They may exist, but I would have no idea how they would work. And there is a minimum set of positions that every team must leave the draft with. Now, this is not a hard and fast rule. Like, most software will not completely enforce that. What will actually instead happen is you won't have that player to start now, and you will be out points. So it's more of a, well, it'll cost you down the line kind of enforcement. So let's talk about the fantasy regular season a little more in depth. So fantasy football regular season, like I said, will go from week 1 to week 13 of the NFL regular season. And then those playoffs are going to go weeks 14 through 16. So those are the 3 weeks you're getting. There's usually a trade deadline in week 8. It doesn't have to be like this. Some leagues might push it earlier or farther, but it's generally going to be in line with the NFL trade deadline. And then each week, like I've said before, you play in a head-to-head matchup against another player in your league. Now, you're going to play every team in your league at least once. You're not just going to play the same guy over and over. Now, this is, to be fair, this is not true if there are more teams in your league than there are weeks. If you have a 20-team league, obviously you cannot get to everyone in 14 or 13 weeks. But if you have an 8-team league, you'll in fact hit quite a few players twice. So each week in a fantasy regular season, and this is also true for the playoffs, you have to set your lineup for your upcoming matchup. And this is important. When a player begins actually playing their game, so when an actual NFL player starts playing, you cannot move them from their spot on the roster. To give an example, Patrick Mahomes, the starting quarterback for the Kansas City Chiefs, will play tonight. If he was on your bench when he started playing, you can't move him. You can't suddenly put him at your quarterback spot. He would have to have already been there before the game starts. That's important. So it is your job as a manager to account for bye weeks that your players have, along with any injuries that come along. It's just part of the game. And injuries will always come along. So pay attention. All trades, generally speaking, some leagues do a voting system, but most trades will be approved by a commissioner of a league. Although if that commissioner usually fails to respond, that trade will go through. This isn't always the case, and this is definitely the most unique thing I have up here, but it's also usually the most common setting I have found in fantasy leagues. So before I get started on this idea, does anyone have any questions about how kind of the fundamentals of fantasy break down? They're not sure how it works. I just want to make sure that we are all on the same page so that when I start talking about strategies for this stuff, people are aware. Does anyone have any questions? All right, I don't hear anyone, and I'm going to keep going then. So first idea, I'm going to go kind of in chronological order as best I can. So I'm going to talk about the draft first. So the draft is all about value, not names. So what do I mean by this? Well, a common mistake of a lot of fantasy players is to draft their team by position, and they'll try to grab the best player available at a position they haven't yet drafted. So they'll try to get like, let me get the best running back, and then the best receiver, and then the best tight end, and then the best quarterback, and they'll kind of go through a list like this. I take issue with that approach. So instead of grabbing the best player available for a specific position that you don't have, players should just focus on simply grabbing the best player available, right? If there are 3 guys who are clearly better than a position you don't have, you're still better off taking one of those 3 guys, even if they're not at the right position. So another common mistake, especially for new players, is to try and just draft names they know, or more specifically, names that had a big year last year. Big years will almost never repeat, and this will often lead to disappointment for the person who drafts them. As an example, last year, Alvin Kamara had a pretty weak year as a player, yet a year before, he was a fantastic running back. Todd Gurley has kind of had a famous fall off in his career, and even Aaron Rodgers has seen quite the decline in points. Ultimately, you should try and prioritize the value of each pick you make rather than roster composition. And that's kind of the big takeaway here. So I want to talk about some strategies for this, just so you're not left with this big idea and don't know what to do with it. The strategies for this idea. There's a lot of sites that are going to offer free draft boards. ESPN, NFL.com, CBS. I like to copy their info into a spreadsheet because I can color things and stuff like that. But generally, these will actually do a lot of the things for you. They'll be organized by position. They'll generally be organized by round value. Especially ESPN, I know, does this. So they're a great starting point. What this style of draft board allows you to see is the value left at each position. This allows you to be informed on what you can draft now and what you can wait on. For example, if there are 8 receivers left that have a grade of, of a round 3 type of player, but there's only 1 running back left that has that high of a grade. Well, you're probably better off picking that running back right now because you know you can probably get one of those receivers later on. And that's the idea of going for value. Find the best value pick right now rather than just the best player for a position you don't have. Because if turns out the next tight end is graded at round 9 and it's round 4, but you don't have a tight end, you're better off picking someone who's graded for round 4 than picking that tight end. You're just shooting yourself in the foot otherwise. So in general, this is not always the case, but in general, you should draft the highest graded player remaining each time you pick. This year, this strategy allowed me to get 3 guys with round 1 grades. I was pretty happy about that. And this will, in fact, give you higher probabilities of finding starters in later rounds or obtaining depth on a position that no one else has. And this can position you to make really strong trades. So maybe it does turn out that you're weak on receiver or tight end. But as it turns out, your 5 of the top 10 running backs are on your team. Well, you can trade a couple of those running backs to increase the strength of your roster without hurting yourself, right? And that's kind of the idea of going for value, is that it ultimately positions you to have a stronger overall roster. So that's idea number 1. Does anyone have any questions about idea number 1 before I move on here? Looks like not. I will move on. So idea number 2, and this falls a bit in line. Big names, not equal to big points. So the dream player for any fantasy roster is the set and forget style of player. This is where you place them in your lineup and you never worry about it again. And it's often attempted with star players. No player is set and forget, not one. In fact, many star players are not worth the hype. As an example, Odell Beckham Jr., easily one of the biggest stars in the modern NFL, has not been a top 10 receiver in fantasy football since 2016 when he still played for the New York Giants. And last year, he was only the 31st highest scoring receiver. So in a 10-team league with 2 to 3 receivers per team, Odell wasn't worth a roster spot anywhere. That's kind of incredible. But this is the idea that big names are not necessarily equal to big points. Now, in the case of Odell, I actually believe this year will be a little bit better for him, but I think it's an easy example to point out. Another example, Cooper Kupp. He's a receiver for the LA Rams, and last year he was the 4th highest scoring receiver overall. He had a game that he scored 0 points and 0 catches. That's painful. So what does this mean? Matchups should always be carefully examined for your players, star player or not, each week. And in fact, a bad team can still have 1 or 2 great players, and a great team can still have 1 or 2 bad ones. And this can dramatically affect the matchup for your specific player. As an easy example, a bad team can still have 1 great corner, and maybe your receiver has to play against them. And so even though the rest of that team is terrible, your receiver is not going to have a good day, right? Or maybe you're playing against a team with a great run defense, and you know you wouldn't want to start a running back, but as it turns out, they're really weak against teams that throw it a lot. Then you maybe want to start a receiver playing against them. So star players, no matter what, even them, their matchup should be carefully examined, because their big name will not necessarily guarantee that they're just a big point lock every single week. That's idea number 2. Now, any questions about idea number 2 before I get on to what I think was my favorite one? Looks like not. I'm not hearing anything. So I'm going to go with idea number 3 here. And I think this is definitely the most different approach I take compared to a lot of others. This idea, I titled it, "Your bench doesn't play for you." Why did I call it this? So if you don't know, a feature of any given fantasy roster is the presence of 5 to 6 bench players. So these are players that are on your roster, but they don't count towards your point total. So many players will make the mistake of treating bench players like backups, but this is not what they are. Bench players should be treated like your lottery tickets, where each one has the potential to break out into a high-end starter. What does this look like in practice, though? So each year, I am relentlessly swapping out my bench players with various free agents with the hope that that lottery ticket effect will happen. But I like to really distill this down into one idea. Your bench players don't play for you. They sit on your bench and score 0 points, right? I don't want a guy who's I designate as a backup and scores 6 points every week. I don't want that. I want a guy who, is he going to score 6 points occasionally? Maybe, but he has the chance to start scoring 15 or 20. That's what I want. So I'm happy to trade one decent starter and 2 to 3 bench players for one really good or great starter. Because to me, I see that I'm only getting one really good starter for a decent one. The bench players, they don't play for me. So why does this strategy work? Because it doesn't make sense on the surface, right? Some players are better than others, you know, and that kind of is just how it is. But this strategy works because the NFL is always fluctuating. And every year there are new breakout players and new letdown players. And these new breakout players will always surprise people, right? So an easy kind of incredible example would be last year would have been Lamar Jackson. 2 years ago, Lamar Jackson was not a great player for fantasy purposes. He just wasn't. And now last year, 1 year ago, he became one of the greatest in history. So there's always a chance that a player could turn into, you know, an incredible starter. Now, Lamar Jackson levels of change are not probably going to happen, but that chance exists. So that's idea number 3. Any questions about that idea? If not, I'll move on. I don't hear anything, so I'm going to keep going. All right, this is the final idea, idea number 4. So fantasy football is not about return on investment. It's about points. So if your starters are doing poorly or not living up to expectations, don't be afraid to swap them out. You should treat your first-round picks like you treat your free agent pickups. I have dropped first-round picks before, and I'll probably do it again. So the sunk cost fallacy is real. Try not to fall into it. If you don't know what the sunk cost fallacy is, it's this idea of, well, I've sunk so much into this thing already, I might as well keep going, right? Or I've invested so much that it's pointless to quit now. Well, not the case here. Your goal is to give yourself the best chance to win every week. So you should put out the roster that you believe gives you that ability, not the one you hope will work because you invested a lot in it. So example here, by the end of each fantasy season, my starting roster, it's often radically different than how it began. And in fact, I'm sometimes left with only having 1 or 2 guys on my whole team that I drafted. And there have been years where that player is like my kicker right? And every single other person has been swapped out of it at some point. So it's all about return on investment, not about, well, it's not about return on investment. It's about points. So I want to talk about some resources to get people started on this kind of stuff, because I realize just throwing some big ideas at folks isn't really helpful. There needs to be somewhere to go. So if you're looking for some free draft boards, ESPN, NFL.com, CBS Sports, and Yahoo Sports, they're all fantastic starting points, and I'd recommend them to pretty much everyone. For a great all-around resource, if you're looking for kind of an all-in-one thing, check out fantasypros.com. They have a lot of tools for basically anything you can think of for fantasy football. I don't know all the tools they have. I just know there's like tons and tons and tons. There are paid premium versions of their stuff at Fantasy Pros. I think the baseline free versions are excellent. You don't need to pay for it. If you want to do some analytics on your own and need some raw data, there's profootballreference.com. They have decades of raw data for individual players, and fantasypros.com. Well, they don't have as much data. They're also good for this. So if you want to just stick to one site, Fantasy Pros is probably the way to go. If you want to learn how to do some analytics, I would recommend a very similarly named site, fantasyfootballdatapros.com. They have a lot of walkthroughs on how to do your analytics for fantasy football using Python and Jupyter notebooks. If you've never touched Python, they even have tutorials of how to learn Python by doing fantasy football analytics. So it can be a fun time that helps you win some money from your friends while also giving you some versatility in the workplace. If you want to try a paid resource, I would recommend, there's a guy named Brett Coleman. He's a content creator on YouTube. I would recommend his Patreon, which is $1 a month or more if you want it to be, for access to his awesome draft boards. They're really well organized. I use these every year, by the way. This is what I use. If you're looking for a great YouTube channel to check out, I would check out his channel. It has a show called The Film Room, gives great fantasy advice, gives kind of interesting football breakdowns. And if you're interested in that kind of topic, it's a great place to go. So let's kind of sum up. The draft is all about value, not names. And the way you can find value is by creating or finding a round-by-round positional draft board. Second, big names don't guarantee big points. Set and forget players do not exist, and many star players are not worth the hype. Third, your bench does not play for you. They get you 0 points. You should treat your bench players like possible starters, not designated backups, and pick up players accordingly. Finally, fantasy football is not about return on investment. It's about points. And you should treat your first round pick like the free agents you picked up halfway through the season.